This week, let's continue this portrait airbrush series by painting a small study of a mouth. If you're just starting out and learning to paint portraits, this is a good one to practice and to try out because it's one of the most forgiving parts of a portrait to paint, especially when it's only the lips and the surrounding skin texture. There's no question that full portraits can be intimidating, but if you break them down into smaller paintings like this one, they become much more approachable. And I wanted this tutorial to be beginner friendly, so I made sure to keep it pretty simple by only using a few colors, kind of like a limited palette, and going with a 3/4 profile view. And if you're new to painting or this whole art thing, 3/4 profile view means where the subject is just slightly turned to the side. So you're not looking straight on, the face is just slightly turned, and that can make it a bit easier because you don't have to deal with perfect symmetry. So if you're going to be painting along with me, up on the screen now is my completed painting. So set this to full screen, take a screenshot, and you should be able to use this as your reference. And as always, on the members page right here on YouTube, I'll be including the high-res images and the reference JPEGs, as well as the gridded versions. For the color mixture, I'm only going to be using 3 colors, burnt umber, sepia, and scarlet. These are Createx illustration colors, which makes them erasable. And for mixture 1, which is the lip color, I'm using about 5 parts burnt umber, 5 to 8 parts of sepia, and then about 10 to 20 parts of scarlet. And then for the second mixture, which is the transparent flesh tone, I'm using about 5 parts of burnt umber, 5 to 8 parts of sepia, and then about 3 to 5 parts of scarlet. And remember, this is important, that color mixing is not like a recipe. It's very rare that colors mix exactly the same each time you mix a new color, so you want to make sure that you just kind of play around with your mixtures and get a color that you want. These mixtures should get you in the ballpark though, and then you can adjust them as needed. Like always, I sketched out my initial drawing using a 2H pencil and a 1x1 grid. And it's up to you to decide how you want to transfer your contour lines over. You could do it freehand, grid, tracing paper, projector, really whatever you're most comfortable with. And I'm painting this one on a smooth canvas that I prepared myself. And it doesn't matter what surface you're painting on, you just want to make sure it's smooth and you have at least 2 layers of gesso on it for this technique. The reason that gesso is so important for me is that it allows me to soft erase into the paint. So with all of that intro stuff out of the way, let's start this painting. I'm using the first color mixture, which is the lip color. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to start by painting the upper lip. In order to get that upper lip painted in, I want to get in that transition point between the upper and lower lip. So I'm using a bunch of different shields here, and I'm lining them up with my initial drawing, which separates the 2 lips, and then just spraying below the shield. This way I get a line below the upper lip, which is sharp enough, but still light enough that if there's any problems with it, I could easily erase into it. I decided to use shields for this, which just seemed the easiest and most practical to me, but just remember that there's no right way to go about this. If you want to do it differently, that's completely fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with using something like some Frisket film, placing that down, cutting it out, then spraying over that instead. Really, you just got to experiment and play around to see what you're most comfortable with. From here, what I'm going to do is start adding in some of the textures, some of the creases in this upper lip. My favorite tool for this is always just a ripped piece of copy paper. When you rip it, the edge gives you kind of a subtle texture so that when you spray over it, that texture transfers over to your canvas. You can see that I sketched out a few of those lines beforehand. So what I'm doing is lining up my piece of paper with those initial line drawings, and then just kind of spraying or directing the paint onto the paper itself. This way the overspray from the airbrush just lightly gets onto the canvas, giving me a softer line. In any painting, it's always important to know where the light source is coming from. So this is just a simple test and observation, especially for any of you new painters. If you take a look at my completed painting on the left, see if you can figure out which direction the light is coming from. I'd recommend pausing the video to take a minute or so to figure it out, because observation is everything in painting. It's way, way more important than any painting technique that you could learn. So it's obvious here that the nose is casting a shadow on the left, and also the left side of the lips are darker in shadow, which means that the light source is over to the right. So if we know that the main light source is over to the right, that means highlights are going to be on the right and shadows are always going to be over to the left. This one may also have a secondary light source or reflected light in the center, just because of this brighter highlight on the lower lip. But regardless of that, the main light source is above and over to the right, which is what I'm going to be thinking about during this painting. So with this ripped piece of paper, what I'm doing is spraying in the shadows on this upper lip. Again, I just rest it onto the canvas, and then when I spray the paint, I'm spraying it on the piece of paper. Now, when I'm spraying these in, I don't really care which direction that I'm spraying the paint. It would make sense that if the light source is over to the right, you should be spraying the paint to the left, but it doesn't really matter for this technique, and you'll see why within the next few steps. Now you'll see that as I'm adding in the shadows, I'm doing this on a blank canvas, meaning that I don't have any layer of paint down underneath this. The reason that I'm doing it this way is that it makes it so much more forgiving. If you spray any of these too dark or in the wrong direction, it's so easy to switch over to the eraser and erase them right back out and then start again. What I'm doing now is I'm using the airbrush freehand because I already have some of these sharp lines in, but I want to get them a little bit darker. So if I want them darker, I can spray right over them freehand, and the initial line is still going to stay there. It's not going to go anywhere because this paint is transparent. All that's going to happen is it's going to get darker, and so is the surrounding area. The right side of this upper lip starts to kind of fade away, so there's not too much texture here, meaning that I'm not going to add that many lines on the right side. Mainly keep them over to the left. At this point, the painting definitely looks strange. This is something that you kind of have to get used to as you're painting. You have to slowly work toward the final painting. You don't just do it in one shot. So even though I know that this looks strange now, I understand that this is going to get me to where I want to go. So I'm using my airbrush freehand with the same color in it, and then lightly glazing a very thin and even layer of this paint across this entire upper lip. We'll definitely need to be sharpening up some of the edges, but for now, I'm just doing this freehand, and I don't really mind if some of the overspray gets onto where the flesh tone is going to be, because it's such a similar color that it's not going to make that much of a difference. The upper left side of this lip definitely needs to be sharp, so I'm using a shield here, lining it up with my line drawing, and then lightly spraying right over the edge. Spraying light is so important here because if you spray too much, that line is just going to be way too sharp, and things in life and in nature don't really have sharp lines, and they never have outlines around them. Outlines are what makes something look like a cartoon. It's going to flatten the image. So just understand that when you do this, everything should just be kind of soft and blend from one value to the next. Just above the lips and in the center, there's a groove in the skin. It's a vertical groove. This is called the philtrum, and sometimes people refer to the lower part of it as Cupid's bow. And in my painting here, I want to sharpen up that transition point on the lower part of the philtrum between the upper lip and the skin texture. So I apologize that my hand here is kind of blocking the camera view, but all I'm doing is laying my shield on that edge, then again, just spraying lightly over it, just to sharpen that line up. So now I have the edges in and defined along the outside part of the lips, but I have to say that they're definitely too sharp at this point. We'll adjust that later using an eraser, but for now, we'll leave it like this just so we know our placement. And like I said before, I want to keep the right side of the lip softer and less detailed, so I'm not using a shield to spray around those. This way, it just kind of helps give the painting a bit of a photographed look, like the photo was taken with a wider aperture. That's what I'm going for in this painting, but if you want everything sharp and defined, you could just use your shields and just spray everything to give it a sharper edge. So now that this upper lip is in, I'm going to start adding that shadow over to the left side of it. When I add a shadow like this to the left side, this is going to help round this part of the mouth away. The area that's brighter looks like it's catching light, meaning that it looks like it's closer to us, and the darker area looks like it's rounding away. There's a small shadow with a sharp line over to the right here, so I'm going to use my shield with this same color, the lip color, and then just lightly spray over it. That way I have that shadow in, and I know where it's going to be for later. So before I go any further on this upper lip, what I'm going to do now is start adding in some of the surrounding skin tones. The reason I want to put some of these flesh tones in now is just to cover up some of the white canvas. So I'll go up to the top here and start painting in the lower part of this nose. And of course, we're not going to be painting the whole nose, just the nostril and that cast shadow underneath it. And this way we just have some reference points around the mouth itself, so the mouth is kind of set in place into the portrait. In order to do this, I'm using a small shield, and you can see that I lined it up with the lower part of the nostril and just sprayed over it. I'll do the same thing over to the left here, line it up with my initial drawing, spray over it to get in the contour lines. And once I have those lines in, I'm going to continue using this flesh tone color and just start darkening up the values, focusing on what I see. This painting tutorial isn't about painting noses. I do want to make a more advanced one in the future. So I'm going to speed through some of this, but you can get an idea of what I'm doing here. Just paying attention to what I see in the reference and making sure I get the dark part where the shadow is underneath the nostril and the cast shadow over to the left in dark enough. I'm also using this flesh tone color to spray into the skin just above the lip. This is really important because it's going to allow us to erase into the paint and blend that transition point between the lip and the skin texture just above it. You can see that I sprayed some more of this flesh tone over to the left where the shadow is, and then less over to the right. Now I'm switching over to my eraser. This is an ink eraser, which is aggressive and helps cut into the paint a lot more than a traditional eraser. And I'm going to start working with this on that transition point between the lip and the philtrum. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to erase in small circular motions or small hatching motions over this point. As I do this, I'm softening up that edge, and I'm also adding a very subtle highlight. The top part of the upper lip is always slightly protruding, and if the light source is over to the right and above it like this, it's going to catch more light, so it will have a highlight there. As I'm doing this, I'm working pretty slow and I'm using a pretty light amount of pressure. You don't need too much here just because the paint is so thin. And I'll just work my way over from the right to the left, slowly erasing this edge and giving a smoother transition. As I'm doing this, you could see that that outline that we got from spraying over the shield is starting to disappear. So instead of having a dark outline along the top of the lip, which remember flattens an image, makes it look like a cartoon, we now have a highlight which is going to make it look more realistic. Now I'll take my eraser and start working into the lip itself by erasing out highlights to the right of each one of these shadows that we painted in. So you can see this area that I'm erasing out, there's not much paint there, so I'm just going over it a few times with this eraser, making it lighter. When we pull that out, it's going to make it look like this part of the lip is just slightly protruding and then the shadow is just kind of rolling away. It's very similar to what we did before by spraying some paint on the left side of the mouth to make it look like the mouth is rounding away. Now here what we're doing is the same thing but on a micro detail, and we're going to create that same illusion on each one of these wrinkles too, by erasing highlights to the right, making that highlight look like it's slightly protruding and then the shadow looking like it's farther away. If I want some very small specular highlights, I'll use an electric eraser like what I'm doing here. And what I'm doing is just going in that area that we worked on before below the philtrum on the upper part of this lip and just tapping in a bunch of small dots. I want these dots to look random and overlap, so I'm just kind of tapping them in quick on that transition point to make it look like some light is catching it and reflecting off. You may have noticed that these highlights are a bit too bright. That's pretty normal with the electric eraser just because it's so aggressive. I will spray some more paint over the top of this later to knock those values down. Then I'm going to go back to my stick eraser and start working into this lip, pulling out the highlights to the right of each one of these shadows. As you put these highlights in, you'll start to see this texture come together. It'll start to look like an area is raised and then an area is lower, making it look more natural and more realistic. But remember, when you do this, you just got to take your time. You don't want to be erasing randomly in any direction. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to those shadows and making sure the highlights are to the right. I know that the left side needs to be darker, so before I erase there, I'm going to spray some more paint on the left side of this upper lip, then go right back over to the eraser, do the same thing I just did, add highlights to the right of each shadow. I'm going to add some small creases and wrinkles here on the transition point between the top lip and the skin texture itself. So I'm using mixture 1 here, that lip color, placing down a ripped piece of paper, and then just spraying over to the right to get a very subtle shadow in there. And as I'm adding these in, I want to make sure that I don't add too many. Sometimes if you're just starting out, you realize, oh, you could add a wrinkle, so you think more would look better. But a lot of times in painting, less is more. Subtlety is the key to making everything look a bit more natural. So you can see that I just placed about 3, maybe 4 up on the top here. And then I will use my eraser and start softening them up and adding highlights to the right. Earlier in the video, I said that I don't really care which way I spray the paint for the shadows, and you'll see why here, because as long as I erase out the highlight to the right of each one of these, that shadow is going to work as a complement for that highlight and it'll come together. So I don't really care how I spray in my shadows. As long as I get them down, I know that I could switch over to my eraser and blend them in and make them look natural. So let's speed through some of this as I work my way down, doing the same thing of adding in highlights. If I notice that a shadow is too light, I'll do what I'm doing here, spray some paint over it to darken it back up, and then go right back over to the eraser and continue erasing, pulling out highlights and texture. When you're painting on gesso like this, you have a lot of control by how much pressure you use on your eraser. I know that I say this all the time, but I think this is a good example here. On the right, where these are a bit brighter, I'm using a lot of pressure. And as I go to the left where that shadow is, like right here, I'm just using less pressure. You can see with less pressure, you still get a highlight out, but it's more subdued, it's more subtle, and the highlight just isn't as bright. And that's what I love so much about painting on gessoed canvas. You just get a crazy amount of control that you really can't get from any other type of painting surface. And if I want some really bright specular highlights, I'll do what I'm doing here by scratching out some paint with a razor blade or using that electric eraser. And then once I have these textures down, I'm going to go back to the airbrush, and what I'm going to do first is darken up that transition point between the lips, and then I'll spray a thin glaze of this paint over the top just to kind of darken everything and just kind of push back some of these highlights. So now this upper lip is essentially done. So what I'm going to do here is go back over to the flesh tone and my eraser and start working on the skin texture just above this lip. I want to blend this upper right corner of this lip into the painting, so I'll just use my eraser for that, small circular motions, a few light passes over the top of it, and then I'll just set it back. Now, as I'm painting in the flesh tones here, I'm going to speed through some of this because, like I said before, this is really about painting the lips, not painting skin texture and the nose. But in the future, I will have a full detailed video only talking about skin texture, and I'll show you all the techniques that I use. I know that I explain these techniques in all my portrait videos, but I do want to do one where I just really focus on it, nothing else but the texture. But to sum it up quickly, the majority of it is done with the eraser. I love using the eraser because it's basically a drawing tool and you get full control just because it has such a small point and you could pull out highlights exactly where you want them. And then you combine that with the airbrush for the shadows and then just constantly mixing and matching the two, building it up over and over to get to a final texture. And as I'm erasing out skin texture like this, I'm just kind of pulling it out usually in small circular motions, but sometimes I'll just add some vertical ones to kind of mix and match it so it doesn't look like the same texture across the entire skin. Again, we'll come back to skin texture in a future video, but for now, let's start painting in this lower lip and finish up this painting. I'm going back to the first color mixture, which is the lip one, and the first thing I'm doing here is painting in the lower shadow underneath the bottom of this lip. Just like before, I'm using a shield to do this. Remember that no shield is going to fit the curve perfectly. I'll use whatever I have around. As long as you rotate it, move it around, you get pretty much any shield to fit any curve. And then just like the upper lip, I'm going to use a ripped piece of paper and I'm going to start working from the left side over to the right, putting the paper down, just resting it on the canvas, and then lightly spraying the paint on the paper, letting the overspray just dust onto the canvas. You'll notice here that the left side of the painting I'm working on now just looks a little blurry. It looks soft. That was my mistake. I use single point autofocus on my camera and I set it a little bit too far to the right. So I do apologize for that. This part is going to be a little bit blurry, but it'll clear up in a minute. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that there's not too much texture in the center of the lower lip. It's pretty simple here. The majority of the texture is obviously on the upper lip, and then on the lower lip just over to the left side of it. So I don't want to add too much paint to the center of this lower lip just because the texture is going to be a lot more diffused there. So if I keep it light, it's a lot easier to erase into. So right back over to the eraser and doing the same thing I did on the upper lip, pulling out the highlights to the right side of each one of these. And as I'm erasing these out, I'm always thinking about the amount of pressure that I'm using. If I don't want it too bright, I use a smaller amount of pressure. And if I want it really bright, I can use an electric eraser like what I just did here. Just tap in a few bright highlights. And then with the stick eraser, just use a lot of pressure. That's going to pull out more paint and make the highlight brighter. So as I work from the left side to the right side, you can see that that small amount of paint on the right side of the lower lip is going to help me out a lot. The reason for that is when there's less paint, it's much easier to erase into. So you're not really, using all this force to pull out the paint. If it's a small dusting or a glaze of paint like it is here, it's just so easy to just lightly go through it. So you're not really, kind of pushing all your weight into the painting to remove paint. And sometimes if there's a lot of paint and you let it dry for a few days, it's pretty tough to erase, even with an erasable paint like Createx illustration colors. but I've definitely built up the calluses on my hands, so I'm kind of used to erasing into it and using a lot of pressure. And as long as I'm able to erase out paint using different amounts of pressure, I get that control. So I don't mind it if I have to do a bit more work. Now, as I'm moving along to the right side of this lower lip, you'll notice on my completed painting that I do have a few small, very bright specular highlights in here. Just a few tiny dots where it looks like some light is hitting it and directly reflecting off of the lip. And the end of the stick eraser is just a bit too blunt. Even if you sharpen it in an electric pencil sharpener, it's just not small enough to get tiny, small, bright highlights. So what I'm using for this is my electric eraser, and I just ran it over a piece of sandpaper just to sharpen the edge so I have a tiny point at the end of it. And you can see what I'm doing here with that very sharp, thin point. I'm just tapping in a few dots. This way it's going to look like a bunch of small specular highlights. Now this part is definitely difficult to show or to demonstrate in a video, but what I'm doing here is just kind of floating the edge of the electric eraser off the canvas. And then what I try to do is kind of just like bring it down to the canvas until I hear or feel a small amount of friction. That means that the eraser is touching the canvas and removing paint. And when I do this, it's almost kind of like bouncing it off the surface with a tiny, tiny amount of pressure. And you can see what you get here. You just get these really, really small dots. If I press this electric eraser into the canvas or used any force, it would pull out a much larger highlight. So in order to do this, you just kind of need to float the electric eraser above the canvas and then gently press it to it, just constantly lifting it up. And to break up the texture, I added a few kind of like squiggly lines there to the lower part of this lower lip. That way it's just a different texture, a varying texture, and it helps break up that pattern. And at this point, both lips are done. So what I want to do now is just get in some of the flesh tone and some of the shadows underneath the lips to kind of set it into the portrait. I'm switching back over to the second mixture, which is the flesh tone mixture. Then I glazed a small amount of paint along the lower side of this, mainly to the left where it's a bit darker. And I'm also using one of these homemade skin texture templates that I have and just resting it on the canvas, lightly spraying over the top of it just to get in a bunch of dots and some small textures. Then once I have these in, I'm going to go back to the airbrush freehand and just glaze a thin amount of this paint over the top. That way I have something to erase into. And then you guessed it, right back over to the eraser to start adding some texture and some highlights into the lower flesh tone here. And at this point, the painting is basically done. This is the fun part. This is the part that I enjoy, where everything's kind of in place. And then I'll just use my eraser to go around everything and just lighten up some areas that I feel are a bit too dark. And if some areas are a bit too light, I'll use my airbrush to glaze a very thin amount of paint over the top. For this part where I'm cleaning things up, one thing that I absolutely recommend doing is step back from your painting. Look at it from a distance. When you do that, when you stand back from it, you see the painting completely differently, because as you're painting, you're right up on it. You're just seeing it really, really close up. But as you back away, you'll naturally see less value and be able to see major or macro values much, much easier. Then you can compare those values to your reference and adjust whatever you need to. For me, it's always about what you see and what you observe. So if you could see it in a different way, in a different light, I found it to be an invaluable way to judge my work. So I hope that this paintings tutorial was helpful. I wish you all the best of luck in your own paintings and just keep at it. And my advice is to try not to get discouraged if something doesn't turn out right, because every failure is always going to help you improve. And most importantly, above all else, enjoy that time that you spend painting. I want to say thank you so much to the generous support of the channel members, which you see scrolling up on the screen right now. They really help keep this channel going, so thank you all so much. And that's it. That's where I'm going to wrap this one up. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.